Now it is my great pleasure to introduce officially our guest speaker. Mickey Edwards has observed the political world from every angle possible, it seems. As a member of Congress, for 16 years a senior member of his party's congressional leadership, a high-ranking member of the Appropriations and Budget Committees. As a teacher at Harvard, where he taught for 11 years and won one of the school's top teaching awards, and then at Princeton. As a journalist, a newspaper reporter and editor in Oklahoma City, weekly political columnist for the Chicago Tribune and Los Angeles Times, weekly political commentator, in addition, on NPR's All Things Considered. As a vice president of the Aspen Institute, where he runs a political leadership program. And as an author with articles in publications ranging from The Atlantic to The Public Interest, in the book that brings him here today with us, The Party versus the People, published by Yale University Press. Praises in the press and a critical part of political reform campaigns across America. When his editors at The Atlantic read what Congressman Edwards described in the article that led to this book and what he proposed, they titled his article, How to Turn Republicans and Democrats into Americans. So here is Congressman Mickey Edwards, who can tell us what is broken, and in addition, how we can fix it. Congressman?
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. First of all, I do have to say this in terms of the title, because I can't take credit for, I wrote The Parties versus the People, which is a very boring title, and I admit it. And when the editors of The Atlantic, because it started as an article in The Atlantic, when the editors of The Atlantic put on the article the title, How to Turn Republicans and Democrats into Americans, my first reaction was, that's pretty harsh. I work in Congress, I work with Democrats, Republicans, all good people, love their country, want to do well. I said, turning them into Americans, isn't that kind of harsh? And they said, well, did you read what you wrote? And so I'm going to talk about, what I wrote. I want to say, in the introduction, you heard that I run a leadership program for the best young political leaders in the country for the Aspen Institute. And two of those people I am so proud of, good friends, are here. Lisa Madigan, the Attorney General, and Chicago Alderman Will Burns. We're really great friends, and they're our future. I should say I'm really excited to be back in Chicago. I actually grew up on the southeast side down by the Indiana border, and my dad worked in the Loop, and we would come in and have lunch at Wimpy's. Nobody here remembers Wimpy's, or go to Berghoff's and would come down later. I wrote for had a weekly column in the Chicago Tribune. When I was a kid, I have already met somebody from the Cubs, I got to say. When I was a kid here, we would go out to Comiskey to see the White Sox a lot. So, I love Chicago, and I'm really honored to have a chance to be back. I want to start with this kind of, Eva, I was thinking about you here, just to pose something to kind of get us into what I am trying to say. When I was in the House, I was the ranking member of the House Subcommittee on Foreign Operations. And one of the things that you do on the Subcommittee on Foreign Operations, you have a lot of areas that you cover, but one of them is foreign aid. And when you decide, how much foreign assistance we should give from the American taxpayers to other countries, you look at a lot of criteria. There are many different things. One of them is that country a democracy? Because, it's not the only criteria, but it matters. You want to support democracies. And so I started thinking about that. I thought, it's never easy. These decisions you make in Congress are never easy. And I thought, what if a country came and said, well, we have elections, we are a democracy, but when you look into it, they've actually set up a system where small groups of insiders, sometimes as small as like 0.1% of the population, decides who can be on the ballot, decides who can run. And they've also set it up where these insiders can work it out so that people who might vote against them won't be able to vote in the election. Would you give foreign aid to that country? And usually, no. That's the United States. So that's what I want to talk about. That's the United States. So here's how I came to this, because after I left Congress, by the way, I was a partisan. I was a member of a political party, grew up in political parties. And I was in the middle of it when I was in office. And when I went to teach at Harvard, one of the things about teaching is that when you're in the classroom, you're really on. You're pumped. You know what you want to get across. But when you're not in the classroom, you have time to think, to reflect, to observe, to say, what did I see? What's working? If it's working, why does it work? If it doesn't work, why doesn't it work? And a couple of principles kind of arose in my mind. I was giving a talk to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and somebody in the back of the room got up after I talked and said, "Oh, you're a systems engineer." Well, I don't know what systems engineers do or who they are, but I thought about that because there were a couple of truisms that struck me. If you have a company, any other kind of an operation, and it isn't working right, one of two things has happened. You've hired the wrong people who don't know how to run the system and make it work, or there's something wrong with the system. The other truism that I realized, and it's true about capitalism, it's true about psychology, it's true about, and that it's the incentive system. What you reward is what you get, and what you punish is what you don't get. And I started looking then at our political system because I was watching what was happening in Washington, where people in both parties, by the way, I hope I'm going to be insulting both parties equally. But what I would observe is that no matter what it was, a Supreme Court nomination, a budget, or any other, repairing bridges, whatever it was, people on one side of the aisle would not talk to people on the other side of the aisle. Automatically, it was our team against the other team all the time. And people started using this term all the time, dysfunction, that our government was dysfunctional. It's not. Why is it not? You get in your car in the morning and you put the key in the ignition and you turn the ignition and the car comes to life. It's functional. It works the way it was designed to work. And when you turn on your TV, you take the remote and you push it and the TV comes on, it works. It's functional. It's working the way it was designed to work. What I realized is our political system is working the way it is designed to work, not by the Constitution. In fact, our political system in almost every way goes against what the Constitution envisioned. So what do I mean by that? Let me give you some examples. And I'm going to mention names, and I want to tell you, it doesn't matter to me in every case whether the person I mention is somebody you think is great or is awful. It's not the point. When Joe Biden became vice president, there was an empty seat for the Senate in Delaware, and his son, Bo Biden, who's the Attorney General, just stepped down as Attorney General, I guess, didn't run. And the reason Bo didn't run, one of the reasons, was because he knew he couldn't win. And he couldn't win because everybody in Delaware knew who would be the next senator from the state, a guy named Mike Castle. Mike Castle had been the governor. Mike had been their member of Congress. He was very popular in the state. And so, Mike's a great guy, and for all I know, he was already measuring drapes for his new Senate office. But he had to run in a primary, because that's what we do. You have to run in your party primary. You have to get endorsed by your party insiders, and he lost the primary. He lost to a lady named Christine O'Donnell, who won that primary with 30,000 votes in a state of 1 million people. So here's the question. Why did Mike Castle not run in the general election? Because he would have clobbered her. Who cares about the primary? He could run in the general. He would win. He would be in the Senate. Delaware has a law. Okay, I don't know if anybody here is originally from Delaware, so I'll be careful. Okay, well then if I'm insulting Delaware, I'm sorry. But Delaware has really a weird law. It's called a sore loser law. That if you run for your party's nomination, either in a convention or in primary, and you lose, you're not even allowed to be on the ballot in November. So 30,000 people were able to tell 1 million people that when it comes to choosing a U.S. senator who decides whether you go to war, what your taxes are, or any of the other major policies, they couldn't do it because the guy they wanted couldn't run. So let me switch over to the other. Utah. Senator Robert Bennett running for renomination to the Senate. They have a convention there. And in the convention, when Bennett was seeking renomination, he lost by a very small margin in a convention of 3,500 people in a state of 3 million people. 3,500 people in a state of 3 million. He could not run in the general election because Utah has a sore loser law. Those 3,500 people in a convention, who goes? The hardliners, the ideologues, the people who are the most partisan, who goes? We're able to tell 3 million people, sorry, you cannot choose the person that you would have clearly chosen to be in the United States Senate. So the guy who won, a guy named Mike Lee, and he may be the greatest senator you've ever heard of, or he may be the worst. That's up to you. But I thought, where did Mike Lee become prominent? He was the number 2 guy who, in terms of the quote government shutdown, there are people in this room, I'll bet, who think shutting down the government was the best thing that was ever done, and there are people who think, my God, was that awful? But it happened. So Mike Lee was one of the people. Who was he working with? Who was the lead guy? Ted Cruz. So I started saying to myself, well, how did Ted Cruz get to be a United States Senator? And I looked at it. He ran for the U.S. Senate. He had never held office before. And he ran for the United States Senate against the incumbent lieutenant governor, a guy named David Dewhurst, who had won 3 times statewide and received as many as 3 million votes. And he ran in a primary against Dewhurst, and Dewhurst beat him badly, more than 10 points. But there were a lot of guys in the race. And so as a result, Dewhurst did not get over 50%. They had to have a runoff. And $8 million of outside money came in to help Cruz, and he won in the primary, in the runoff. He received 630,000 votes in a state of 26 million people, 1/52nd of the population of the state. And as a result, David Dewhurst, who would have beaten him in the general election, was not allowed to be on the ballot. So the question is, this sore loser law that allows the hardcore ideologues to tell the people of a state or a congressional district who you can choose among, how many states have that law? That crazy, undemocratic, unconstitutional, that's not unconstitutional, should be. How many states have that crazy law? 46. You're living in one. This is, I could use other examples. By the way, I'll point out, some other cases. I'll throw in a Democrat here. Ed Markey from Massachusetts, I think, is a good friend of mine. Ed and I get along very well. But I wondered, Ed ran because Torbert McDonald, the incumbent, died in office. And so Ed ran in a special election. There were 7 people running in that election. And he came in first, and Massachusetts doesn't have runoffs. So Ed Markey got 22% of the vote. 78% of the people in his own party didn't want him. Sore loser law. He got to be the only Democrat on the ballot in a district that always votes Democratic. That's how he got to be a member of Congress. So what happened when I talk about the incentive system, we have created this system that everybody who's in Congress today, one of two things. Either they have a political point of view that is different from the rank and file voters. You know, he or she has a point of view that is in line, in sync with the more hardcore. Or they are more in line, they're like us, they want to do the right thing, but when they're elected, they're looking over their shoulder at a primary where they can get knocked off, as Dick Lugar did in Indiana, as Mike Castle's career ended in Delaware, as Robert Bennett's ended in Utah, you know, by small groups of hardcore, and that's who you are afraid to offend. You're not interested in appealing to the entire electorate and what they want, because the future of your political career is in the hands of the hardliners who dominate the primaries, because that's our political system. We have turned over access to the ballot to two private political clubs who can tell the population, here's who you have a right to choose among. So I mentioned redistricting, so I want to mention something about that. I'm a city guy. I'm wearing penny loafers, which nobody does, but yeah, I'm a city guy. And I was the first member of my party elected. I'm a Republican, okay. So I was the first Republican elected from my district in Oklahoma City since 1928. And my district was 74% Democrat. And I won. Nobody knew how I won. My mother didn't know how I won. But I won. And so the other guys wanted to try to take me out, and they couldn't. They couldn't beat me. So they redrew my congressional district. So it went from the middle of Oklahoma. Oklahoma is a lot bigger than Illinois. It went from the middle of Oklahoma all the way up to the Kansas border, halfway across to Arkansas. And I thought, look what they did to me. They didn't do it to me. Because there's a provision in the Constitution that every senator and representative must be an actual inhabitant of the state from which they're elected, because the idea is you know the people, you know their economy, you know their concerns, they know you. You are their voice in Congress. And guess what? Because it suited the party to put, in this case, it suited the Democrats to put every Republican they could find into my district, since they couldn't beat me, and make the other districts safer for them. I, city dude, was representing wheat farmers and cattle ranchers. Didn't matter what was their interest. It suited the party's interest to have them represented by a guy from Oklahoma City who'd never been on a farm. Because it is the welfare of the parties, not the welfare of the people, that has begun to govern how our political system works. So, you know, we can get into other things and money and all, you know, there's a lot of different factors. But I want to point out that, as always, the ability to change things is in our hands. We can. I'll give you one more example of how bad it is. So I served in Congress, you know, for 16 years. There is, obviously I don't use it, there is a lectern here. And probably every time you come to one of these, there's a lectern. Because that's what you do. How many of you have ever seen the U.S. House floor? You ever notice there's not a lectern? There's two lecterns. There's a Democrat lectern and a Republican lectern. First time I was there, I was so full of myself that I was so wise and I could convince anybody of anything, that instead of standing at one lectern, I stood at the lectern in front of the Democrats, you know, because I was going to persuade them I was right. And I was at the Democratic lectern, and there was a gasp. And people came, this is a true story. Republicans and Democrats alike came and said, no, you have to stand over here at the Republican lectern, like you're going to get cooties if you touch one that a Democrat touched. But, you know, you can't You can't smoke on the House floor. You can't read a magazine on the House floor. You can't eat a sandwich on the House floor. It's not becoming. You go to the cloakroom, but there's not a cloakroom. There's a Republican cloakroom and a Democratic cloakroom, and you don't even read the sports pages together. If you want to get on a committee, which is where the power is in Congress, how do you get on the committee? Everybody there elected by the same size constituency, same oath of office, all Americans. You get chosen for a committee by your party leadership according to whether or not you are going to stick with your team. It's not about whether you're going to do what you think is the right thing to do. Are you going to be sticking with your team? So what's happened is, I'm not the only one who sees, my God, how did this happen? How did we turn our democracy into a rivalry between two clubs, like the Bears and the Packers? How did we do that? Well, you had the sore loser laws that came out of the progressive movement in the early 1900s and the late 1800s. You had all these other rules changes. And you know what? Other people see it just like I do. And the USA Today had an article that said the American people are fleeing from the political parties. 40% now register as independents. And in 2006, the people in Washington State said, we're not going to take this anymore. And they went to the polls with an initiative petition. And they ended party primaries. And now in Washington State, every candidate for governor, for senator, for whatever office, is on the same ballot. Republicans, Democrats, Greens, Libertarians, what have you. And if nobody gets over 50%, they have a runoff. Could be 2 Democrats, could be 2 Republicans, whatever it is. But they all have to appeal to the entire electorate because everybody gets to vote in that race. Republicans, Democrats, everybody, the entire constituency gets to choose. And in 2010, California is bigger than, most of the countries. California went to the polls, and they did it. They ended party primaries, and they ended, party control of redistricting. And as a result, the New York Times ran an article that said in California, it may be more left than you want or maybe more right than you want, but in California, they're actually able to come together and get things done. Because people have to say, how do I get reelected? I get reelected by getting the support of all of the electorate, not just the people on the inside of my party. So that's what I'm trying to say. What people argue, so you asked me, John, about the second question about the quality of the people compared to what it was 20 years ago. Seems self-serving, right? Because I was there 20 years ago. The quality's the same. You can't tell this by looking at me, but I still work out in the house gym. And I see people there all the time, and I talk to them. The people, right or left, Democrat or Republican, love this country. They want to do the right thing. They are trapped in a political system that if they work with people on the other side, they are threatened with a primary. They are taken out in many cases in a primary because the hardliners now dictate our political system. And I was shocked when I have given speeches all over the country about this. And what I discovered is that most political scientists had never heard of sore loser laws, never put together, the laws and the redistricting thing, had never said, duh, this is the system we created. Why are we shocked that it's producing the outcome that system would create? So, I talked to editorial boards. They'd never heard of these laws. But we have to do something. I'm not going to tell people in Illinois how to run your system, obviously. But we have, last night I gave a talk in Milwaukee. And, just for the heck of it, I didn't have time to do this before I came here, but just for the heck of it, I said, well, is this a problem just in Delaware or Utah? So I said, let's see what happened in Milwaukee. And in Wisconsin last year, a few months ago, they elected a new member of Congress, So I looked to say, I didn't know at that point whether we were Republican or Democrat. I said, how'd this person get elected? So this is a person who now has all of the power that accrues to a member of Congress getting to vote on, taxes and spending and all these things. This was somebody who ran in a primary where he got 23,000 votes. There's 700,000 people in that congressional district. Got 23,000 votes. Won the primary, came in first in the primary by a margin of 215 votes. 66% of the people in his own primary voted against him. And because there's a sore loser law, got to be the only member of his party on the ballot in a district that leaned heavily in that party's favor. So when you look at Washington, don't just say, what's wrong with these turkeys up there? Why do we have so many stupid people? Why do they not care about the country as a whole? We have created an incentive system that forces people, unless they just give up their jobs, and step out, which is really hard. You've served 10 years, already given up your career. You've already given up your legal practice, medical practice. You're staying on top of whatever business you are. You want to keep your job just like everybody else wants to keep their job. And the way you keep it is by not antagonizing, the people who can remove you. If you dare to think for yourself and to talk in a friendly way and listen with an open mind to people from a different point of view and say, where can we find an area of common ground? So that's why I say we need people who can not only be loyal, true, loving Americans, but who can function as Americans in common, not as champions for a club they joined. So that's the basic argument, and I'll be glad to, answer questions or whatever. So whatever next.
I'm just curious, not on the ballot or not on the ballot for that particular party, could I run as an independent?
It's very, very hard to run as an independent, but you can't run as an independent in those states. You can run as a write-in. Now, that's how actually Lisa Murkowski got elected in Alaska. Very, very hard to win an election as an independent. Yeah, it's very hard. By the way, before somebody asks, well, what about Joe Lieberman? Joe Lieberman lost in his primary to somebody who was way to his left, Ned Lamont, but he got reelected to the Senate. What happened? Connecticut's one of the 4 states without a sore loser law. Just thought I'd throw that in. Yeah, just saying. Yeah.
Our senators in Illinois, Senator Kirk and Senator Durbin, have actually cooperated to a substantial extent. One of the factors that you didn't talk about, though, was money, which
right.
To many of us in our experience is a much more important factor than sore loser laws.
Well, I think they're all important. If I had to start with something, I would get rid of the sore loser laws. And I actually, in my book, I probably have taken the most extreme position about money. Now, I know there are lawyers in the room, and I'm a lawyer, and so I probably am not allowed to say this, that on Citizens United, and corporations are people. I don't know what those guys on the court were smoking, but it's not legal here probably. What did they know? They may know constitutional law, but they clearly don't know corporate law, which makes a clear distinction between corporations and individuals. But my position is actually probably a lot stronger than a lot of the reformers. When you go to vote and you're standing in line at a polling place, there's nobody in that line except another human being. And what I advocate, and advocated in the book, is that there should be no money in any political campaign except from individuals in limited amounts and transparent. And that means no corporate money, no labor union money, no political action committee money, no party money, nobody but individual voting human beings contributing to campaigns. Because I do think that the money chase is so bad, and it's driven by the parties and the party control over committees and all, so that today, if you're a Republican or a Democrat in the U.S. House, you not only have to raise the money for your own reelection, but you have to raise $300,000 a year for your party. And you don't do it, you don't get the committee assignments and so forth. Yeah.
Let's say your protege, Lisa Madigan, wanted to work to get rid of the sore loser law here. And she goes to you at the Aspen Institute and says, okay, how do I do it?
Yeah.
What's the answer, Guru?
I must say that, you know, I'm here, lucky enough to be here largely at the instigation of my friend Catherine Gale, who is on my case all the time saying, okay, you wrote the book, you know, you said here's the problem, you said here's the solution, how do we make it happen? So there are, I don't know the law here. The one thing about our election laws is that except for very few things, now when you talk about Congress, except very few things, how old you have to be a U.S. citizen for 7 years, so forth, that it's really, these decisions are up to each state. It's state by state by state, not the federal government. So 24 states have initiative petitions. That's what they had in Washington State and in California, where the leadership of both political parties opposed the changes. And so people got together and said, well, to heck with them. You know, and they went out and they got people to draft legislation to change it. They put it on the ballot. They got the resources. They got people to contribute money. They found volunteers, you know, all over the state, got signatures to put it on the ballot, and that's how they did it. The other states that don't have initiative petitions tend to have one kind or another of a referenda system where either the legislature's decisions can be appealed by the voters, or the legislature can just pass the buck, and you start pressuring at a town meeting. You show up and you start, you know, demanding of your state legislators that they pass this onto the ballot and let the people decide. So there are a lot of different ways to do it. It's easier when there's an initiative petition. It's a lot harder when you have to go through a referendum process. But in most states, there is a way to get something around the people who are in office. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh. Did I go out of line here? Okay.
There's been some discussion or experimentation, I think, in California with jungle primaries. What's your take on that?
That is the system. Some people call it jungle primary. Some call it open primary. Some call it, you know, all kinds of names. That's the system that they put in California that I endorse. It may not be the only solution, but where everybody's on the same ballot and everybody gets to vote on that ballot. By the way, I don't actually call it a primary. I probably do in the book. I probably call it open primary because that's what most people call it. But it's really a general election. It's the election because everybody's on that ballot, and if nobody gets over 50%, you have a runoff. So it's a general election with a runoff. But I'm very much in favor of them. I don't know that that's the only solution. But the idea that you allow, I don't know whether it'll be more left or right, but it'll be more democratic. It'll be the people who get elected will be the people who represent the views of the electorate. And so that's, yeah, I like that. Yes?
If there are extremisms in both parties, what do you see as the Democratic Party equivalent to the Tea Partiers?
I have to be careful how I say this because I'm closely related to some of them. There are people who, when President Obama, you know, tried to suggest some kinds of changes that would affect welfare programs, or when Bill Clinton did, you know, with end of welfare as we know it or whatever, there was a lot of pushback from the left. It's not organized under a rubric that I know of. You know, maybe it's the people who watch MSNBC. I don't know, but there are on the left, just like Lamont who beat Lieberman in the primary, there are people on the left who are uncompromising, who basically, Nancy Pelosi, who is a good friend of mine. Pelosi does this a lot. You know, and even when Obama says, well, we're gonna make this accommodation, she'll say, no, we're not. So, you know, there are people on both sides who just say, we have not everything is a matter of principle. I'm not trying to say set principle aside. Not everything is a matter of principle, and even those things that are matters of principle, there is some way, maybe it's not in the middle, but there's some way to settle for less than everything that you want. And so I don't know. I think people who try to blame one party are taking the easy route out, because if you just say, well, the other side's crazy, people on the right say the left is crazy, people on the left say the right's crazy, they're avoiding the issue. You know, that doesn't change it. We have to stop attacking people just because they disagree with it. Can I add one more part to that? There have been studies, Pew just had a study that said that even though there's much more willingness to compromise with other points of view among the electorate at large, among a certain pretty good sized and growing segment of the electorate, there is this inclination to see people who disagree with them as evil, bad for the country. You know, it is, there was a friend of mine named Bill Bishop wrote a book called The Big Sort that talked about how, everybody in this room, by the way, is an exception. Everybody in this room is an exception. But would talk about how most people hang out with people who think the way they do. Watch the shows they watch, read the columnists they read. They read Will or they read Krugman, but they don't read both. And so, you know, there is this problem we have to get past. And Democrats have them too. It may not be under an organized rubric, you know, like Tea Party or, you know, or it could be Move On, could be whatever. But people who say, this is the truth, we have seen the truth has been spoken to us, it has received wisdom now, and we will not yield.
So I have a follow-on question
Okay.
to that, which is, is my mic on? My follow-on question is, there are new bedfellows on some interesting issues like criminal justice and
Right.
sentencing reform. E.J. Dionne, we were just talking about, he's going to be down at the Institute on Politics this spring, and his column today talks about, on the right, an interest among middle class and working class people in economic justice, making them, unusual bedfellows
Yes.
with some folks who are traditional Democrats, and shaking up the right on the Republican side. What are your thoughts on that, and do you think it's going to have a big impact going forward?
I think that there are some good signs in terms of economic justice issues or smart on crime kinds of issues and, you know, things like that. I think, you know, people like Lisa and Kamala out in California and others working very effectively on issues where people can come together. But here's the counter to that. I mean, I agree. I think that's a good sign. Yesterday, the day before, this congresswoman from North Carolina, Elmers, whatever, was saying on the abortion question, she did not go along with the most hardline positions that some of the people in her party wanted. So there was a story in the paper the next day already threatening her with a primary. So there are people who really want to work together. They want to find a way. But then, you know, somebody says, if you do this, you know, we've got somebody who's going to knock you off next time, and it's a deterrent. Okay, your turn? Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
I have a practical question on the repeal of the sore loser laws and how it would actually work from a voter's perspective.
Uh-huh.
If you go from having two choices on a ballot, if I walk in instead and see 3, 4, 5 names, how do I avoid the splintering of that vote that then requires perhaps one, maybe two runoffs, and thus creating the same small turnout problem that you have in the primary at the runoff?
Well, first of all, you wouldn't have two because you would have the top two would run against each other, so it'd be one runoff. The runoff would in fact, if you're talking about like in California and Washington, the runoff is the general election. So you don't have the problem with, whoever wins that is the person who takes the office. So you should be able to get a good turnout. And same turnout you would get in a general election, which is pretty bad. Anyway, However, can I throw in an aside, because it goes into this about bringing up the question of turnout, and this is a totally different issue, but I'll mention it. One of the things, besides the fact that we divide ourselves into rival camps, and I haven't met all of you, so I don't know how many of you are educators, and there's probably a room full of college presidents here, and but we no longer teach civics. We no longer teach critical thinking. We don't. Our schools have become woefully deficient in preparing people. All of our schools that I know of have become vo-tech schools. Now, I'm a lawyer, so that's a vocation, training you for it. That training people to make a living and to do well in their chosen profession, which is very, very important, but we don't do a very good job of teaching people to be citizens, including voting, being aware of the candidates, being aware of the positions, being able to analyze, dissect ideas, and weigh whether or not they're good, who's on the other side, and so forth. So that's a cultural problem. So forgive me for the little aside, but okay, yes.
Thank you. I wanted to just have you reflect a few moments. 16 years in Congress, teaching at both Harvard and Princeton, and obviously thinking a lot about the way our country works. If you were to have a clean sheet of paper and you look at the House of Representatives, how long should those terms be before people come back to be elected again? Your perspective.
Which is another way of saying, am I for term limits or whatever? No, I'm not. Well, or for longer terms. Here's what I think. Two things. And I'm only familiar with the House. I'm not familiar with the Senate, the lower house. I don't know them. The fact is that the term limits are the term limits that the voters themselves decide upon. If they think 2 years has been too long, they kick you out. If they think 20 years later you are still actually representing them very well and you have now gotten the experience and the knowledge to be able to represent them more effectively and to be able to counter the executive branch, which is really the constitutional role of the legislative branch, which is supposed to make the policies and the laws. So I favor term limits when the people have decided that it's time for you to go. That said, again, I don't know about the Senate, but in the House, I was back almost every weekend in my district, and most members of Congress are. I would have, I would have 100 or more town meetings every year. And so here, I'm going to tie it into the criticism I also have too. So it wasn't that I didn't know what was on their minds. It wasn't that I wasn't staying in touch with my constituency. The problem was, going back to the whole question about civics and all, is that I could look back and say, wow, this year I had 20,000 people come to my town meetings. Actually, it was 200 who came every time. And so you do, it's not that members of Congress do not stay in close touch with their constituencies. That they do. But it is skewed, again, by the people who participate in that interaction and the people who don't. So, but I'm not in favor of term limits other than the ones you all impose. Yeah.
I'm the president of a community college right outside of Chicago, Moraine Valley Community College. And we started an initiative on our campus about 4 years ago called the Democracy Commitment. I'm not sure if you are aware of it, but it is a national movement to get more students interested in understanding their civic responsibility. Because what we found was that so many young people are apathetic toward elections and not understanding the impact and effect that they have on them. So as a comprehensive community college, we understand it's our responsibility to teach them outside of the classroom their responsibilities through this initiative. So if there are any other colleges here in the room today, I would welcome you to join that conversation.
That's actually great. So, hands-on, experiential, getting people involved in community activity and in political races and all that stuff is really critical. I think, so we have a low turnout. The question back here raised this point. We have a low turnout in primaries. And we have a low turnout in off-year elections. And in off-year elections, which is, I mean, that's just the Congress. It's not the president, right? So who decides foreign policy? I mean, presidents think they do. But who decides? Who decides what treaties can be approved? Who decides who can be an ambassador? Or you take, who decides who can be Secretary of State? Who can be Secretary of the Treasury? Who decides, what you spend, when you spend? All the major power of our government, all the major power without exception of our government is in the Congress of the United States. And we are full of citizenry that doesn't understand that and that says, we'll wait till the president, because the president will come up with somebody really good to be Secretary of State or Attorney General if the Congress says okay. This president will nominate somebody really good for the Supreme Court. Well, actually, the president has the authority to suggest to Congress, who would be a good Supreme Court justice, but the Congress decides. I mean, so what you're doing about trying to teach civics and have people understand that is so valuable, and that would be done in the community college level, where we reach a really broad range of the citizenry. Hooray for you. Hooray for you. I hope other people here do join you. Yeah.
Quick question. One thing we saw at the last presidential election was that the mechanics in the voting booth were a lot there. There were a lot of issues there.
Right.
And now the president's put together a committee to make some suggestions to try to rectify those. What do you think are, if you look into your crystal ball, some of those things that the committee might suggest, and what do you think would actually make an impact in preventing some of the lack of participation from large elections like we saw?
Well, this may shock a few people. We have, there's all this stuff about voter suppression and all this stuff. We have for years, for decades, had a system of elections that is biased against working class, because we have elections on a weekday where in many places still you have to vote in the precinct where you live, and the polls close at 7 o'clock. And that's really great if you have a law firm or you own a business, or I'm just going to take off and come back when I'm ready to take off. But there are a lot of people who are working in a factory far from home, or who are, require long bus rides or train rides to get back to a polling place. So where I would start, there are probably a lot of answers, but where I would start is finding some way. There's all kinds of things. People have said, have mandatory days off, or or hours off to be able to go vote. There's all kinds of different solutions. But I would come up with a system that makes it easier for people to go vote who want to vote, not harder, and remove the barriers we have now that make it so hard for so many people to get to the polls. Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Right.
So the thesis seems to be that partisanship is worse today than it wasn't historically, or that the parties have more power than they used to. So can I just push back on that a little bit? So
Yeah.
the day after George Washington took the oath of office, the Federalists formed against the Democratic Republicans.
Right.
And as you know, Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton, and a senator from the South beat another senator to death with a cane.
Yeah, although that was quite a bit later, but yes, right.
Right, and before
Yeah.
the Civil War. So
Right.
is it really worse today? I'd be surprised to see a governor candidate shoot another candidate.
I don't know if I'd be surprised. Yes, because let me, a couple of points on that. I think that's a very good point. During the days that Washington was president and that whole period, we had political parties. But Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison all said, don't create political parties. They wrote it, they spoke it, And what they meant was, don't create the kind of political party we have now. So you had those parties, and they agreed. They came together on 2 or 3 or 4 big issues. What we have today is a party system that is all together on everything all the time. And there was polarization. There was polarization. Are you pro-French or pro-British? There was polarization. Are you for tariffs or against tariffs? But now what it is party loyalty against party loyalty. In those days you did not have, the Madisonians opposed the Hamiltonians. Madison, by the way, wrote the Constitution, and Hamilton may have, in the long term, come out ahead. I don't know, but you had things where they would get into fights over a few things. Now it's all the time. It's if the other team wants it, if this is a president from the other party. We see all the time now, for example, Republicans, my party, support, attacking Obama for things like on foreign policy that George Bush did, and they thought it was fine. And Democrats do the same. It's my club or your club. So it's not the same. It's very different. And so polarization is going to exist. We're a democracy. There are 320 million of us. We have diverse views. There's always going to be polarized differences. What's happened now is you have the partisanship that makes it all the time and makes it impossible to come together, and find a compromise or a common ground somewhere. That's what's different. Partisanship and polarization are not the same. And our problem is not polarization. Our problem is partisanship. So this means, one more. Yeah, okay. I thought it meant I'm gone right now, but yeah. Yes, okay. Okay.
This is a bit impertinent, but having done some research quickly on Google while we're talking, you were always, first of all, my uncle served in Congress for 14 years.
Who?
It was before your time, Ed Hutchinson from Michigan.
Okay.
And he had warm relations across the aisle.
Yeah.
But the Republicans were always in the minority then. When you were,
as they were every single day I was in Congress.
yeah, I was going to say,
Yeah.
do you think your views would have shifted at all if you'd have ever been in the majority?
I don't know whether my views would have shifted. I think it was not majority or minority. It's that when you're in a system, you think that's how it is. That's just you're not thinking, is this right or wrong? You're thinking this is what is. So it wasn't whether I was in majority or minority. It was that when I went to teach at Harvard and had time when I wasn't in class to think about what were the underlying causes of the problems that I saw. That's what made the difference. If I had had time when I was in Congress to really step back and reflect and say, do I really like this? Do I really want to have to please my leader in order to get on the Appropriations Committee and all? Then it might have made a big difference. That's a really good question. All right. Well, thank you all very much for having me here. Thank you.